All right. Welcome. Um, Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Esther Duke from Coalitions and Collaboratives. I'm standing in today for Katie Novak McGrath to host this August branching out session for the Colorado Forest Collaboratives Network. For folks who don't already know, Katie's on maternity leave through the end of the year, so I'll be helping out for a few of these webinar sessions for branching out. And joining me here today to help co-host this webinar is Maria Brandt from the COCO team. She's graciously handing the tech support and participant engagement for the webinar. Maria, you want to say hello? And I think you had a few
Yeah,
housekeeping things.
yeah. I will just cover some housekeeping bits, just kind of what this looks like on the tech end of things, that this is essentially a meeting for all of us to kind of collaborate and speak to one another. But we are kicking it off with a panel first. So tech-wise, patience, thank you in advance, but I have Menti, you have the Zoom as an option to communicate, and then we will be doing breakout rooms later, which I'll be kind of assigning everyone, which will be assigned under each of the panel members. So there's quite a few options to speak up. So because of that, I just ask that as we kick it off with the introductions, the panel discussions, I'll share Menti too, and you'll answer those. There is time for Q&A at the end before you do the breakout room. So if you don't want to ask your question anonymously through Menti, you are welcome to stick it in Zoom. I'll stick it into Menti. But also, if you would prefer just to come on camera and ask your question, just raise your hand, and then you're set, and we'll call you out. So then you can speak up. So with that, have a great meeting. And I'm here, but I'm going to go off camera for now. So thank you very much, Esther.
Yeah, and you can message Maria if you need any help. Thanks so much, Maria. So our topic today is to explore the role that community-based collaboratives play in restoring communities and ecosystems after wildfires. And the panel is going to spotlight some local champions who have worked to improve the way we come together and pool resources after wildfire. So before we get started, we'd love to get a sense of what kinds of experiences our audience members bring to this discussion. So we do have a couple of Menti questions for you all. Maria, could you cue those questions up? So this is our QR code. If you want to scan that, and you can engage in the polling there, that would be great. So our first question is, what does the history of wildfire look like where you work? Interesting. So we've um, got 1 to 5 years ago. It's looking like the front runner here. All right. And I'm glad to see that everybody here knows when the last time a wildfire burned in their area of work. Threw that in there just in case, but I kind of expected that most people would be aware of that in this line of work. So, Maria, you want to go to the next question? If your organization has worked or is working in post-wildfire recovery and restoration projects, what has been the focus of your work? And this is a word cloud, so you can go ahead and share whatever you want to about that. You can share multiple things if you'd like. And it is anonymous, so feel free to put whatever you want in there. All right. So a lot of fundraising. That's always an important piece of the puzzle to be able to do any of this. Reforestation, community, water quality, erosion control. Yeah. Okay, cool. See some infrastructure protection, flood mitigation. And I think we've got folks on this panel who are going to speak to a lot of these things. So, um, all right. Well, thank you for that. Just give us a little bit more sense of where folks are coming from. So joining us are several representatives of community-based collaboratives from across the Front Range. They're here to share their experiences and insights from working on post-wildfire restoration, recovery, and resilience building. If those of you on the panel could please introduce yourselves and share a little bit about your experience or your organization's experience in post-wildfire work. And I thought maybe we could move from north to south by watershed. So starting with Hallie, that would be great. Just try to keep these brief so we have plenty of time for questions. Thank you.
Okay, I'll do like, I think you said like 5 minutes, right?
Yeah, that would be great.
I have just a few slides to share.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Okay. All right, can you all see it? Perfect.
Yeah.
So the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed started after a wildfire. Back in 2012, we had the High Park and Hewlett Gulch wildfires that burned over 90,000 acres in the watershed. At the time, that was the largest fire, at least in Larimer County history. So our organization really was born out of that disaster, and we have continued to do post-fire work since we started over a decade ago, because of course we had the 2020 Cameron Peak Fire, which is Colorado's largest wildfire to date. CPRW works across the entire watershed from the headwaters in Rocky Mountain National Park to the confluence with the South Platte River. Our mission is to improve and maintain the ecological health of the Poudre River watershed through community collaboration. So just to highlight the, the, the fires that the watershed has experienced in the last 10 plus years. Of course, the Cameron Peak Fire, which burned across 3 watersheds, the Laramie River, the Poudre, and the Big Thompson. And then we have the High Park Fire and Hewlett Gulch Wildfire. So a lot of fire in our watershed, and we've been dealing with those issues from the fires since we started. So after the Cameron Peak Fire, we, of course, a really large fire, we have limited resources. And so we initially worked with JW Associates to come together with this prioritization plan that looked at a variety of different things, including soil burn severity, hill slope erosion potential, downstream infrastructure, things like that. And so these areas that are highlighted in red, those sub-watersheds, those were kind of the initial areas of focus for the funding that we received initially. There's a lot of partners, a lot of collaboration. As soon as this fire started, we realized that it was going to be really large. And so, and that there's going to be some major impacts. And so initially there was a variety of different groups that formed, and CPRW helped to lead an effort with a bunch of different groups, including local government agencies, so Larimer County and the municipality, City of Fort Collins, City of Greeley, and others to start mobilizing resources and preparing for what was to come next. So our post-fire restoration is really kind of threefold, and I'm sure Laura is going to highlight some of this too, because we've been working really closely together over the last 5 years on post-fire recovery. So immediately after the fire, we had a really big focus on aerial mulching. So that is exactly what it sounds like, is dropping wood mulch onto priority areas on burned hill slopes with helicopters. So this was done over a 2-year period. So a lot of the data has shown it's really the most impactful to apply aerial mulch immediately after a fire. And the idea is just to get something on the hill slope to try to reduce the amount of sediment and ash that's going into our waterway. So One of the biggest issues after a fire, of course, is the water quality issues. So the city of Fort Collins and city of Greeley, for at least 3 years after the fire, had to shut off their intake structures on the Poudre River for upwards of 40 days because of the water quality impacts. So the aerial mulching effort was a priority for the municipalities as well. And it's very expensive. Millions of dollars, probably I think like 30 plus million was spent on aerial mulching. And we mulched around 11,000 acres across the Poudre and the Big Thompson watersheds. We're also focusing on reforestation. And so right now we're only planting on private land, but we're working with the Forest Service to hopefully eventually be able to plant on public land. We're really focused on planting ponderosa pine right now. And so we're collecting native seeds, so collecting cones and then growing those out in a greenhouse and then planting them in the spring and then the fall. We have a big group that's working on this together, including CPRW, the Big Thompson Watershed Coalition, Trees Water People, Wildlands Restoration Volunteers, the Nature Conservancy, and I think that's everyone. So this has been a really big effort, and we're going to be doing this probably for years to come using a climate model that the Nature Conservancy has developed, and we're planting ponderosa pine at elevations that they're typically not found, so a little higher in elevation, just given future climate predictions. And then finally, one of our big focuses is process-based restoration, including low-tech process-based restoration. So this is an image of a project that we implemented last year on the South Fork of the Cache la Poudre. This area was burned both by the High Park and the Cameron Peak fire. And the contributing watershed is mainly wilderness. And so there was really not much we could do up in the hill slopes. So this is an area that was starved, was completely disconnected from its floodplain. It had prior ag use, so that big meadow used to be a hay meadow. And so a lot of opportunity to just reconnect the river to its floodplain and protect water quality, so trapping and capturing sediment, improving the riparian habitat, and just overall better benefits for the river itself. So this one, what we actually use heavy equipment, but a lot of the low-tech process-based restoration work that we're doing, we're working with hand crews, and everything is installed by hand. All right, that is all I have.
All right, I'm Laura Quattrini, Executive Director with Big Thompson Watershed Coalition. We are the watershed just south of the Poudre watershed, and like Holly mentioned, we have been working hand in hand on Cameron Peak fire recovery efforts. Thank goodness for me that there was already a collaborative group of organizations in Northern Colorado that had started meeting before the fire actually was out. With Hallie's experience, with CPRW's experience with the High Park fire, I think folks knew that it was really important to start planning efforts as soon as possible, especially with the fundraising piece of it. And let's see, I started in my position in January of 2022. So the fire had already happened. Recovery work was already happening. I hadn't been involved with wildfire recovery efforts in the past, in my professional career. So, jumping into this collaborative group was critical for me personally. Also, when I started, we only had 2 people working for my organization, myself and a project manager. And, we had really limited capacity to do a whole lot. So through the efforts, just having guidance from, CPRW and other groups in Northern Colorado, that was really critical to help guide what we were doing in the Big Thompson watershed. And we've been doing very similar recovery activities like aerial mulching, stream restoration, reforestation, similar to CPRW. I will say, well, let's see, what else was going to say? Last year, we also had the Alexander Mountain fire in the Big Thompson watershed that burned nearly 10,000 acres. At the time, several organizations and partners working in the Big Thompson watershed were going through a wildfire ready action plan process, which is a program through Colorado Water Conservation Board. And because we were sort of in the middle of that and doing hydrology and hydraulics models, we had a really good idea of where we should be working post-fire, and that really helped to sort of prioritize where the work was going to go. But there have been a few hiccups with that, which I can talk about a little later, I think. But I'll just end it with that.
We'll pass it on to you, Adrian.
I'm Adrian Knight. I'm the operations director for Coalition for the Upper South Platte. We were also born out of a fire, and I'm drawing a blank on it right now. The Buffalo Fire in 1998 is when we formed. Since then, we did a lot of work for the recovery in the Hayman burn, which was for a long time the largest fire in Colorado. So we have done a lot of work in there. The work that we did in Hayman also got us into doing some work at the Waldo Canyon burn scar, which was slightly outside of our watershed. But since we did have the experience from working in the Hayman, we started working in the Waldo as well. A lot of the work that we do, it's a lot of handwork. We have a field crew that goes out and does the work, which is actually where I got my start, and a lot of my experience came from, is working on that field crew. But a lot of low-tech handwork stuff like log erosion barriers. We've done a lot of raking and seeding, a lot of log fall structures to address head cutting. Tree planting, working with volunteers, collaborating with the Forest Service, as well as private property owners and volunteer groups. Yeah, and I'll just keep it brief and leave it at that until questions come up.
Right on. I guess that leaves me. I've got a couple of slides as well that I'll throw up here. Can you see those okay? Right on. Well, my name is Sam Kalin. I'm the Lake County Watershed Coordinator with the Arkansas River Watershed Collaborative, or ARWIC. We're a watershed group serving the Arkansas River Basin. Personally, I'm based up here in Leadville, that tiny little red arrow in the top left corner up there. A little bit about us. ARWIC champions watershed health initiatives for economic, ecological, and societal benefit throughout Colorado's Arkansas River Basin. We create resilient and healthy watersheds, build networks of informed and active community members, and provide expertise and support in the wake of wildfire. And so that last piece there of our mission, is pertinent to what we're talking about today. We've been engaged in numerous post-fire recovery projects over ARWIC's history. Some of those include the Spring Creek Fire, the Hayden Pass and Decker fires, and most recently the Interlochen Fire in 2024 here in southern Lake County, which burned for about 2 weeks in mid-June of last year. And that's pretty much what I'll be talking about today. The Interlochen Fire, compared to some of these other ones, pretty small potatoes fire at 700 acres. Here's a picture of it burning at night from across the reservoir. But something that was interesting about this fire, and the reason it caught our attention, is it was situated abutting and just above the Twin Lakes Reservoir. So there's a lot of values at risk there, and that pretty immediately caught our attention and some of the stakeholders in that reservoir's attention as well. So over the course of summer and fall of 2024, we worked to coordinate with the Forest Service and the water companies and some other local groups here to assess the erosional potential hazard for the reservoir, and pretty much to figure out if we could do anything to preempt those hazards with speedy action before any big rain or snowfall. And so ultimately, what we were able to do over the course of that process was coordinate stakeholder and volunteer work days where we brought hand crews, bodies and people and saws into the burn area, and we built erosion control structures at the foot of the scar where it abuts the reservoir. And you can see that in some of these photos here. Our primary purpose with that work was just to keep massive blowouts of woody material and sediment from heading into the reservoir. And this is, it's a process that is ongoing. This was last year that the fire was burning, and we're still doing work on it now. But so far, we've been really happy with the results of that work, both in terms of the efficacy of the treatments on the ground, how they held up over the winter and spring of this year, as well as the process. In general, we were able to have success with those treatments because of the organizations and the people involved, and that we were able to get moving quickly, I think speaks volumes to those groups. And yeah, I'll be excited to talk more about that in a little bit, but I'll leave it there for now.
All right. Well, thank you all. Some great photos of the various efforts, and I think we've got a good diversity of perspectives on this panel with different kinds of experience in this work. So I want to invite our audience members, if you want to just raise your hand, come on camera to ask a question, or if you prefer, you can type your questions into Mentimeter, and Maria will relay those. And as folks are thinking of their questions and all of that, I guess I'll kick us off with a first question, and I'm curious to hear from you all's perspective, your thoughts on how community-based collaboratives or partnerships are uniquely well situated to support this kind of post-wildfire work, and sort of what you bring to the table that maybe other players are not bringing.
I think smaller nonprofits and watershed coalitions have a really unique perspective on post-fire recovery. So, we had been able to develop some really good relationships with private landowners. We are often referred to as a convener, so bringing all the different groups together, stakeholders, the federal, local, state governments, nonprofits, et cetera. And then the relationships that we developed with private landowners were really helpful immediately after the fire. And so both CPRW and the Big Thompson, we were able to help Larimer County get right of entry forms signed so that they could actually access private land to do restoration work with emergency watershed protection funding, along with the city of Greeley. So we really serve as that conduit for the government to connect with private landowners. And a lot of cases, there's private landowners who might be nervous or distrusting of the government. And I think coalitions and smaller groups can really help build those bridges. We're also really well suited to mobilize resources and bring different sources of funding from different entities together. And we've really been able to, actually work across boundaries, so private and public land. And in our case, we've kind of been able to push some limits, as I'd like to say, in terms of advancing some of the restoration techniques that have happened here locally. So in the Arapahoe Roosevelt National Forest and the Canyon Lakes Ranger District, the idea of process-based restoration was really new and it hadn't really been done. But because of the fire, we have been able to implement a lot of these different projects. And we're miles ahead of where we would have been, I think, if we hadn't had the fire. So, now we're really trying to focus on doing this work outside of the burn area so we can be more prepared when the next fire happens.
Great, thanks, Hallie. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think another important role that nonprofits in general can play is that we don't have the red tape that government agencies might have. So it's easier for us to access or use existing funding to hire contractors, to hire staff, even if we need someone to, be managing projects. I think that role in general, not just fire recovery, but with the natural resource management, has been a role that our watershed coalitions can play in partnership with our local and state and federal government agencies.
Yeah, I think like some of the timing issues are real as far as like how quickly different actors can come in and provide different kinds of support. So yeah, that's really, I think, a big piece of it. Yeah, Sam.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I mean, I echo everything that's been said, and something that I'd add is that, the people and the locations, the closer we can get into them and the smaller the groups, I think that provides a tremendous amount of value, for our work. For example, on the Interlochen fire, we mobilized a lot of volunteer hours,
Mhm.
and we were able to make the work that we did a lot cheaper for some of our stakeholders and interested parties who really just appreciated having that in a time of tight budgets. And I think just having the connection to the community and being able to mobilize people was also a really powerful asset.
Yeah, have you guys seen volunteers who've helped out across like multiple different fires at this point where they're starting to get some experience themselves?
I don't know about multiple different fires, although we have had folks come um, from Conservation Corps or other organizations that do similar work in the background,
Mm,
and give their free days to help with this kind of work.
cool. Uh, Looks like we have some questions coming in from our participants. Do you see any gaps in manpower for restoration techniques that may be good avenues for job creation in post-fire recovery?
For sure. Locally, we work with the Larimer County Conservation Corps. So they actually, this year was the first time that we had them help with a low-tech process-based restoration project. But then we realized that unlike we typically work with them for wildfire mitigation treatments, and so they go through the S212 Sawyer training, but there is no like actual trainings here locally for how to do low-tech process-based restoration. And so that was a big learning curve for us. There is another group that we all work with here locally, Alaterra Restoration Services. So CPRW is working with them, Big Thompson is working with them, many other entities up and down the Front Range are working with them, and they're kind of the only one here locally that has the crews to do low-tech work. So yeah, there's a lot of room, I think, for growth here.
That's super interesting, Hallie. Have you come across um, other places where they have good trainings? Like, is there a training you'd like to
There's a
do
training out of
here?
Utah,
Hmm.
at Utah State University.
Okay.
I think that's the most I don't know. That's the one that I think is the most well known, but I'm not sure about other states.
And that's like really training people the hands-on how to
How
do
to,
it.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Very cool. Okay. Yeah, maybe that's something some of us could work together to bring to Colorado.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I had mentioned that when I first started, it was just myself and one project manager. Since I've started, we've actually hired 3 additional people onto our coalition, and most of that was because of the fire recovery funding that we had. We simply couldn't have just 2 people overseeing and coordinating all of these different projects that we have going on, including the ones that we had before the fire happened. So that has actually, I mean, that's one of the benefits, if you call it that, that came out of the fire, is that we were able to grow our capacity to help our community recover from fire, plan for or mitigate for future fires, as well as other watershed restoration or resilience projects.
Right. Yeah, and it looks like John Sanderson dropped a link in the chat to a good manual for process-based work from Utah. So cool. That may be related to the training you were talking about, Hallie.
Yeah. And then I think one of the other big gaps too is with the reforestation pipeline as well. So the reforestation need up and down the Front Range and across the West is enormous. And the crew piece, that manpower piece is something that's missing from the cone collection. So like needing people to actually like climb trees, arborists to climb trees to collect cones, the nursery capacity to grow out the seeds, and then the capacity to actually plant the trees. So that is, I think, another huge piece of the puzzle there that's missing.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of interest, in efforts to look at how we do restoration differently, to really have this workforce development component, as a real opportunity for us as a state to have good jobs come along with this work, and also figuring out, are there post-fire kind of biomass utilization opportunities, and all of those ways that we can diversify our funding of this work. So I think there's a ton of space for innovation, and folks who are interested in funding innovation in this space. All right. Maria, can we flip to the next question? How does the panel balance staffing and resources with the unpredictability of fire location and severity?
Yeah, I can maybe start on this one. I suppose, compared to some of the other folks in this panel, I'm not the one managing staffing. I'm the staff being managed in this situation. But I can speak to the fact that resources and resource allocation with, relation to the unpredictability of fire location has been a real challenge for us. And it was something that, we have worked with funders in the past to try to build flexibility into our programs to be able to respond quickly and across our basin for this kind of work. And that was a really big part of why we were able to succeed in 2024 was some remaining funding in a flexible account. And that's just drying up, it seems. And that's a real issue that we're facing right now. And looking for creative solutions as we speak. So if anybody has any, we'd love to hear them.
Yeah, with less funding comes less flexibility, right? And that's
Mm.
going to be a real challenge, because as we all know, it's not if, it's when and where the next fires are gonna burn. And yeah, I think that like the way that the funding for this is currently allocated, it makes it really hard to have that readiness piece in place.
Yeah, I think for us, having expertise in our organization where you can not only be using it for fire recovery, but also wildfire mitigation work is important. So right after I started, the first position that we hired was a forester position, and she is who led the area mulching effort. So she worked with the forestry contractors who were actually cutting the trees down and mulching them, and then overseeing the aerial mulching contractor. And once that work was over, after the second year, she just shifted to the projects where we were doing fuel reduction projects or, forest health projects. So that, and she also led a lot of our reforestation projects that Hallie mentioned, where we were planting the ponderosa pines in the severely burned areas. And I think because of her forestry background, she already knew some about fire recovery on the landscape. And then with the LTPBR work, that can be used for post-fire work. It's a great restoration tool there, but it's also, I feel like, a great tool to enhance existing mountain streams and wetlands that already exist where fire hasn't necessarily been a recent disaster. And it can just enhance the wetland and potentially eventually become a future fire break. So like a green area on the landscape. So I think that there's ways to just kind of shift gears a little bit. It's hard, like, I mean, of course, we had funding for forestry projects before the fire happened, and we basically put those on hold for 2 years until we started getting some post-fire recovery projects going and hiring more staff and like getting us to the point where we can kind of, shift between the two different areas on the landscape.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, where I was talking about it's all one incident or one cycle, or that and building that into how you do the work, I think is essential and really smart. So thank you, Laura. Anyone else on that one before we go to the next question?
Yeah, I think, CPRW had really similar experiences as the Big Thompson, and we've since hired 2 additional people as well. We had some seasonal workers right after the fire too. We have our post-fire and rivers project manager, and that position we hired for immediately after the fire. So it was like in the spring of 2021. And yeah, when you have disaster, that's when the funding comes. So really now what we're trying to intentionally do is set our organization up so we're better prepared at the staffing level for the next disaster. So, the staff that we have on board now, we are actively fundraising and making sure that we can keep them on board, and also trying to expand our capacity as well. So yeah, this is a challenge every day. This is probably what Laura and I think about every day. Is how are we going to keep that capacity going, and keeping our fingers crossed that we have more time until another disaster hits Larimer County.
And I just wanted to jump in really quickly and kind of highlight and reiterate what Laura was saying about changing gears and the importance of being able to remain flexible, which I think being a smaller nonprofit makes that achievable. So, for Coalition for the Upper South Platte, we have 2 watershed coordinators, and we're also lucky enough this year to have a field crew of 3 members. So being able to have that flexibility where everyone kind of does everything. So having a staff that is trained in all these facets. So a lot of the work that we're doing right now is forest restoration. There's not a whole lot of post-fire rehab going on that we're doing right now. It's more green forest work. But while we're doing this, we're also training the crew so that they are able to, if something were to happen and we had to go in and deal with a post-fire situation, the crew is trained and we're able to just kind of stop what we're doing here and move them where they're needed. And so that flexibility is really important, I think.
Thank you, Adrian. Maria, you want to jump to the next one? All right. Any idea about the efficacy of aerial mulching? For such an expensive treatment, it would be good to know if it worked well or not.
Yes. I also see
A multi-million-dollar question,
yeah.
right?
Abby's also on here too. So with JW, she's would welcome her to jump in here as well. So after the High Park fire, they tried a variety of different types of mulching. So they did like hay mulch and different type of wood straw, and then just regular wood mulch. And they had found that the wood mulch was the most impactful. in terms of like actually reducing the amount of sediment going into the hill slope. So we're pretty lucky here in Fort Collins is the fact that we have Colorado State University and tons of researchers who are really excited and have bring their own funding to help research all the different work that we're doing, including aerial mulching. So after the Cameron Peak fire, so after the Hyde Park fire, there was good data to show that aerial mulching was did make a difference in terms of reducing sediment. After the Cameron Peak fire, some researchers set up a paired watershed study. So a watershed that was severely burned and unmulched, and then a watershed that was burned and mulched. And they had similar slopes, et cetera. And they found some mixed results with that. So it really didn't show a difference at all in terms of the amount of sediment, but I think it was really due to a variety of factors, the amount of rainfall that the different watersheds experienced and those types of things. So at this point, you know, aerial mulching, I think still is and can be a really effective tool, but it's just one tool in the toolbox. So I think in the future, from what I have seen and my experience would be to, instead of trying to mulch 11,000 acres, maybe we choose the highest priority hill slopes and we apply more mulch than we did to start with. And it's really difficult to like get the coverage that you need because of course you're dropping wood mulch out of a helicopter and it kind of just goes wherever. So with the researchers, we actually ended up making several passes for the research to actually get the coverage that they wanted. And so that was kind of a unique thing. So a tool in the toolbox, maybe focusing more on applying more mulch on the highest priority areas and then layering treatments. So in areas where you've done hill slope work with the aerial mulching, can there also be gully and, you know, rill work that you can do in terms of some low tech point mitigation? And then can you do work in the stream on the hill slope as well? So that's really what we're trying to do, is piece together all these treatments in the areas where we've already done work. And so that would be my recommendation. And of course, there's no silver bullet. And I think there's still a lot to learn.
All right. Anyone else want to chime in on the aerial mulching discussion? Okay. Abby?
Yeah, I don't want to take away from the panel. Hallie, that was a perfect answer. We JW Associates helped CPRW and Big Thompson Coalition with their aerial mulching programs. And I would just say we definitely had some lessons learned from all the mulching we did, and based on the research, one of them was to try to apply more mulch over fewer acres, like Hallie said. Just get better coverage to make sure that we're as effective as possible. And the other thing we were considering is how we pay the helicopter operators. The contract that we had set up with them for the Cameron Peak fire was paying them by the acre mulched, and that kind of incentivized them to do a really good job on every acre, because if they could pass an acre, then they got paid for it. So I think that's something to think about in the future if you're thinking about doing an aerial mulching program, is maybe to just pay them by the load or the amount of mulch that they put on the ground, no matter how much area they cover. And then the pairing the treatments is really key. I think Hallie was right on that too. And I think the nice thing about the mulch is it's an upper hill slope treatment, as opposed to just putting something in the stream all the way at the bottom. But there's other hill slope treatments that can work really well, like gully treatments, and it's hard to get those on the ground as quickly as the mulch. But if you could, you know, work on that, I think that would really be helpful to try to get gullies treated in the first 1 to 2 years after the fire, which Sam mentioned Arwick is doing on the Interlochen fire. So I think they'll have some good results from that to see how those gully treatments work. Thanks.
Laura, did you want to jump in with your comment?
Not really. I mean, just that, you know, one of the benefits of aerial mulching is you can treat more remote areas that might be high priority in terms of burn severity and, you know, a concern for values at risk downstream. You know, it is expensive. That's a bummer.
Yeah, I think yeah, being strategic, very strategic makes a lot of sense. Yeah, so Margot, did you have a question? I see your hand up.
Hi, I'm actually Garrett Stevens with JCD. I don't know why Margot's showing up on my name, but had a question about EWP, Emergency Watershed Protection Fund. I know a lot of that was used over the years. Curious if any of the panelists were the recipients or fiscal agents for that, and if anybody could talk about perhaps why certain partners may or may not be able to. I know sometimes certain levels of government like can't or won't be the EWP sponsor, but I feel like that is an important thing to try to figure out before the disaster, because that's like a whole big messy program to wrangle.
Mhm. Sure. So here for the Karen Peak Fire, Larimer County and the city of Greeley, and I think the city of Loveland, Laura, I can't remember, were EWP sponsors. So CPRW was not involved with that, thankfully. There was talk of us maybe becoming the sponsor, and then we all came to the conclusion that CPRW did not have the capacity to manage those funds. And it's a pretty big lift. So after the High Park fire, the city of Fort Collins was the EWP sponsor and Larimer County. And so basically then Greeley took on that role after the Cameron Peak because Fort Collins had already done it. So pretty lucky that we have two big municipalities that take water off the Poudre and are able to coordinate on those types of things. So yeah, it was a big process. We helped in that we were able to get connections for the private landowners to the municipality, to Greeley and to Larimer County, for them to do the work. And that was a big lift for us on its own. And we were preparing for that. That was actually part of the reason why we initially brought on our post-fire restoration project manager, was to help with that, the landowner outreach and things for the EWP work. So because we already had the experience with the High Park fire, I think the municipalities were kind of prepared to take that on when Cameron Peak fire started.
I think, weren't the EWP funds used for area mulching?
Yeah, a lot of the
Okay.
funds were used for aerial mulching, well, some, and then a lot of the just restoration work on the private lands. And I will say, I think one of the downfalls of the EWP program is that the work that they are allowed to do is basically bringing the land back, or whatever it is, the infrastructure back to what it was before. So they cannot, if it was a culvert of X size, they have to leave the culvert the same size. They can't upgrade the culvert. So that's actually, does a really big disservice, I think, because now the watershed, the hydrology is completely changed and we need bigger culverts, not the same size culvert as before. So the fact that they are only able to replace what was there previously, and not, consider the impacts from the fire and future climate impacts, I think is one of the parts of that program that could be fixed.
Yeah, so with EWP funds, you're only supposed to use it on private lands. I know that Greeley was able to get a waiver to that, to be able to treat U.S. Forest Service land in an area surrounding one of their reservoirs, with the knowledge that it would protect private water supplies. And the county, Larimer County, also administered some of the EWP funds for road repairs, knowing that post-fire flooding was going to become an issue. And then most recently with the Alexander Mountain fire, the city of Loveland is now administering EWP funds for that fire. I would say that I think one of the things that's a little difficult with EWP is that you are confined to using NRCS conservation practices. So if you want to be like a little, I don't know, like flexible in the work that you're doing, or, improving a culvert, knowing that post-fire flooding is going to be an issue for maybe 5-10 years down the road. And you can't do it with EWP funds. You need other funds to be able to improve existing infrastructure, because like Hallie said, you can only get something to what it was beforehand. I don't know how they prove what it was beforehand, but that's a whole other ball of wax, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a lot of places you're not going to have that documentation really. All right. So next question is, which post-fire treatment did you find to be the quickest to implement after fire? And what strategies did you use to be able to get treatments on the ground quickly?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about quickest necessarily. I'll kind of skip to the second part of this, but speed for us was a really big part of our strategy in general, getting on the ground fast. And the way that we approached that was through the lens of thinking about what we have to offer, what funding we have to leverage, and then working within the lens of what do our land managers actually want to see out of this. Because at the end of the day, that's who's giving us the green light to do anything. In this case, it was the Forest Service. And we, are lucky enough to have a really good relationship with our district ranger, and our hydrologists, who are both fantastic, and we're really eager to get things done. And what we ended up doing was just bringing them out to the site. After some protracted discussion about what can and can't be done, ultimately we decided to just have them out there and see for ourselves what we can do. And that kind of blossomed into, instead of us working on their behalf, like a really fruitful partnership where we were working together to get a common goal achieved. And I think that was, the key to getting things done fast for us, was just having the presence, and buy-in from the land manager.
Thanks, Sam. Anybody else have thoughts on
Yeah.
getting it quickly?
I don't want to really talk about which treatment, but things to have in place before a fire actually happens so that you can quickly mobilize afterwards. I think, especially if your watershed or whatever your geographic focus is has a lot of federal land, having a participatory agreement with the federal or the U.S. Forest Service in place beforehand so that you can easily come up or use the funding to be able to treat on federal land, and make that happen quickly. Also having contractors, like if you put an RFQ out so that which contractors can do different types of treatments once a fire is done, and you want to be working and you have funding for post-fire recovery, not having to go through that RFP process, and you can just point to whatever contractors, had proposed or given their availability to do work, I think is also important. Those are some of the things that seem to take a lot of time, once you do get the funding and want to make the work happen.
Mm-hmm. So that's request for quotes, right? So that you already have an idea of the costs of different contractors and can prioritize who to go to. Cool.
Yeah, and this was one reason why there was such a big focus on aerial mulching, is because that was really one of the quickest things that we could do right away. And while the fire was burning, we were already making plans for this. As soon as the Bear report came out, that's when all the prioritization started happening for where we were going to do work. So a lot of behind the scene things happened in the winter before summer hit and the summer monsoon season, which is really when the real issues happen once the fire is out. So aerial mulching was a focus because it was a strategy that was that we were able to quickly implement, and things have really slowed down too. So as soon as the Forest Service stopped considering the fire and emergency, which happened about 2 years after the fire, even though we were still experiencing a lot of post-fire impacts. The approval process for getting projects done slowed down to a halt. So basically now we propose a project over a year in advance to the Forest Service, a post-fire project. And it takes them about a year to get all of the permitting and review for us to actually implement a project.
How does that compare to when you were still in the emergency period?
Yeah, the emergency period, things were approved like right away. Yeah, we got lots of categorical exclusions and work. We were able to do work, as soon as we proposed it, basically. So yeah, now it's about a year out or more in some cases.
All right, Adrian.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in really quickly and say, on a small scale, I'm a big fan, and I have been a big fan for a long time of log erosion barriers, and just rake and seed. Those are some of my favorites to start with because they're relatively easy. All your materials are kind of out there with the burnt trees. It's also projects that volunteers really enjoy doing. So we've had a lot of success getting volunteers out after fires to do these sorts of projects because they are fun and easy kind of stuff like that, depending on access, of course. And the strategies that we would use to be able to get this stuff on the ground quickly is having that flexibility of our field crew that's able to do multiple different things so that we're able to just jump on stuff right away, and also our network of volunteers so that we're able to get volunteers to come out and do projects with us on stuff like this with different organizations like Trout Unlimited, different church groups that come out and do volunteer work with us. But going forward, one of the strategies that we're really trying to use to make sure that these treatments get on the ground quickly is we're really pushing for for groups of people that are writing new CWPPs or updating their CWPPs, that there is post-fire planning that goes into those CWPPs as well.
I'm curious from all the other panelists, because I wasn't around when right after the Cameron Peak Fire happened. I don't know how quickly funding came in to the area for organizations like ours to be able to pay for our time. So that was one of the things with the Alexander Mountain Fire. It was not a high burn severity fire, and therefore was deemed not as critical to respond in an emergency fashion. There's not a lot of funding available for fire recovery efforts. So, I've been like scraping, applying for little pots of funding here and there to be able to help cover staff time to work with partners to, try to coordinate some efforts, but it's few and far between. And I don't know, a lot of our time initially was just coming out of our unrestricted funding because we couldn't use project funding from others, other projects, right? So that's a realization that has hit me after this year, is like trying to, stockpile some not really unrestricted funding, but for disaster recovery. Whenever the next disaster happens, we have funding set aside already that is not our unrestricted funds, but can be used to cover staff time if needed.
Well, that's a good point, Laura. We didn't start getting post-fire funding until summer 2021. So, that was, the fire started in August of 2020. And so, yeah, CPRW was using unrestricted funding and funding, scrambling to find resources to pay for staff time to focus on the post-fire needs in that whole interim period. But CWCB did push out funding relatively quickly. So there was like 4 phases of post-fire funding that came out that summer. The first hit in like June, and then there was like the 3 more rounds came in July and August. And then we received some CDPHE non-point source 319 funding that we applied for in the fall, and then that came through of June in 2021, I think. And yeah, so, and then the EWP money came that summer as well. So yeah, but that interim period where like staff is frantically trying to plan and prioritize that funding didn't exist for 9 months.
It's a long, yeah, that's a long gap
Yeah.
to fill. Yeah, so I think some of you know that Coalitions and Collaboratives has been working on this forest and water renewal revolving fund, and one of the ideas with that is for the gap funding to be available in these kinds of situations. Exactly. All right. Let's go on to the next question. How does the panel balance? Oh, we already did this one.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Esther. As
Okay.
they came in, I don't know what like rearranged based on like I didn't touch anything and then it
No
was
worries.
answering questions and I was getting the old questions. So yes.
All right, this one. Have any of you worked with agricultural landowners affected by fire? I think the answer is yes. And if so, how has your response supported their recovery, thinking specifically of ranchers in that rangeland forest land space? Thoughts on this?
We currently work with a ranching operation up in our watershed that was affected by Cameron Peak Fire. I wouldn't say that anything is different about that particular project. Most of what we're doing is the LTPBR work. They have a beautiful landscape that's flat, and we're just working to reduce the erosion in the stream system and reconnect the floodplain. It will be interesting to see, if the cattle will impact that area or not. We do not have plans to put up exclusion fencing. So nothing different on from our perspective.
Right.
I think, Callie, though, you've been doing work with the U.S. Forest Service where they have permits. What are they called?
Yeah.
Permittees. Yeah.
Yeah. So we that South Fork project, the aerial photo that I showed earlier. So that area of the Poudre was closed to grazing since 2018, and then in last year they opened it to grazing, and so we frantically were trying to figure out a way to protect our two projects in that area, Little Beaver and the South Fork. And so the Forest Service received like a big chunk of post-fire money about a year and a half, 2 years ago, and then they tied that up with the National Forest Foundation and also with Trout Unlimited. And so we have some funding from NFF, and NTU ended up actually paying for the fencing materials, and then we used NFF money to install buck and rail fence around the whole project. Even though we did that and we spent like 9 months planning this fence and a lot of money getting it set up, the cows still got in our project site. So cows are going to do what cows are going to do. But yeah, so we think we figured out how they got in, and we're going to have to add in some additional fence, basically, is what happened. So there's a fine line of balancing, obviously working on Forest Service land, it's multiple use, so balancing restoration with ag and grazing, and it's a challenge, but I think it can be done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Abby put a question in the chat that kind of maybe links into the if communication is different with the different constituents that you work with. I mean, specifically, she was talking about, do you try and steer clear of mentioning beavers in your low-tech process-based restoration with ranchers, if there are ranchers who maybe don't really want to have beavers come on their land, and obviously, different ranchers feel differently about that, so there's not a one answer that fits for all of them. But I would imagine that you guys have figured some things out about communicating with different stakeholders through this work?
Yeah, I think it depends on, which properties, what kind of properties you're working on and how big or small they are and how much infrastructure like roads and culverts they have on the property. This particular landowner that we work with, he welcomes beavers, and by golly, we're working to make beaver habitat on his property. With the caveat, or, we've given him an assurance that we would help if a beaver were to be causing problems on his property, we can, address it with him. So, installing beaver deceivers or whatever, that's a possibility. So, we were upfront with him that was our end goal, not only restoration, but making the landscape better. And luckily he's a pretty, progressive landowner. But we've worked with other landowners that, have a lot of infrastructure on their property, and having one beaver on the property can cause a lot of damage. So they're not as interested in having a beaver present. So yeah, it just depends.
Right. All right. Maria, did we have any other new questions in the Menti, or have we gone through those? Okay, so this is about low-tech process-based restoration also, and considerations for pre versus post-fire installations. I think some of you were talking about how some of these approaches you can use in a wildfire mitigation sort of, and just stream health, habitat, like all kinds of other reasons, but are there different considerations?
Not really. I don't think so. I mentioned that we just finalized, well, it's almost final, a wildfire ready action plan in the Big Thompson watershed, and some of our prioritized projects for pre-fire are LTPBR projects. And hopefully those will be paired with forestry projects to be able to make that larger impact on that particular focal area. So with that, certain smaller watersheds were prioritized. So that is really the only consideration, I think, is like, where are you going to put it? Because, obviously with our watershed, it's pretty big in terms of the wrap that we did. It's a lot of acres. So, how do you prioritize across that entire watershed? But we had, through stakeholder input, we prioritized several areas, and that's what we'll try to seek funding for. That is one of the, I think, goals of CWCB, is to have priority projects prioritized, and then they're willing to fund projects like that for pre-fire installations.
Cool. Sam?
And we're at Arwick, we're working on a wrap as well. Actually, coincidentally, in the Twin Lakes Basin. So like right in where the fire was. And so thinking about, we haven't put any of those pre-fire installations in, but similar to like what Laura mentioned, it's a big part of what's coming out of that process. I will say, like, a consideration that we have had on that front is, in our post-fire scenario in that basin, we know the scale and the severity, in terms of designing structures to meet the needs.
Mm-hmm.
We have to be a little bit more cautious looking forward, thinking about not wanting to put anything in place that's going to potentially fail or create more problem than it's worth. When we don't know the scale of what the next fire will be. So it's something that has been on our mind.
All right. Well, I was gonna stop you all at 2:30 to do breakout rooms, but we had a lot of really good questions, so I let it go over. But I'd still like to assign everyone out for just 10 minutes before we come back together to close out this webinar. Just an opportunity for our participants to talk on some small groups about you know, what post-fire work they're engaged in within their watershed or fire shed, and yeah, or what planning, you know, pre-fire planning they have that they're working on that they might want to ask, you know, more specific questions to each other, to the panelists. So each of our panelists is going to end up in one of those groups. Maria, if you want to assign folks out to those, that would be great. And we can come back together just like 5 minutes before this webinar ends to